George W. Bush is, however, a Bush. Now, the Bush family is a completely different kettle of fish than George W. Bush standing alone by himself. Okay, the Bush family, and probably one of the biggest investigative pieces that I wrote after 9/11 was absolutely proving of massive insider trading on the financial markets. And I'm talking Tokyo, Toronto, New York, London, Berlin. So there was obviously huge foreknowledge with massive put options being placed on American and United Airlines.
Welcome to another episode of Media Mayhem. Today's episode is going to be part 2 with Michael Ruppert, investigative journalist. He's actually a former LAPD cop turned investigative journalist. And I think something just before we get started that I wanted to explain to you guys, and I had a better chance to get to know Mike since the last interview. And part of what is really important, particularly for our show, is that Mike gives you a look into the kind of investigative journalism that's rapidly disappearing, because even when he was doing some of his best work, he was writing it somewhere where it wasn't going to be censored in his own newsletter. And I think that people should listen and hear about some of the important work that he's done and realize that this is kind of missing on the spectrum these days. And when you're looking at mainstream media and even a lot of the internet, you're not going to see this kind of reporting. And this is what you should be looking for and demanding from your journalists. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mike to the show again.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Thanks for coming. I wanted to just I give everybody sort of a quick idea that you're an author, an investigative journalist, author of 2 books, Crossing the Rubicon, The Decline of the American Empire at the End of the Age of Oil, and also Confronting Collapse, The Crisis of Energy and Money in a Post-Peak Oil World. And we spoke a little bit about, and you currently host a radio show, The Lifeboat, on the Progressive Radio Network. And you also mentioned that you wanted, in relationship to your book Collapse and also the movie Collapse, that you have a website that people can go to.
I founded a company called Collapse Network, or CollapseNet. You can find it at collapsenet.com, not .net, but collapsenet.com. And it is a daily synthesis and a digest plus original work by writers I've worked with for many years. That uses credible sourcing from mainstream news media, but not the headline overview stories, but the detail stories, to form a pretty accurate picture that replaces what people are not being told as the overall big picture in the mainstream. I mean,
and we were talking before the show even started about the fact that you don't look to mainstream media for your news. And why is that?
Well, I do look for well-sourced reporting on small, if you will, substantive stories on smaller points. In other words, a bill being passed here or an incident that took place here. That's done as we know how to do as journalists, with proper sourcing, attribution, and so on and so forth. I don't use mainstream news media at all for anything that involves a general picture of anything, because I don't trust it. Absolutely don't.
So, and you said, I asked you, and I was curious, when you hear the U.S. government announcing that they've done something, whether it be under Obama or former President Bush 43, when you hear that, you seem to automatically distrust what you're hearing.
Absolutely.
And on a gut level. And where does that come from? Why is that? Because I think people watching are going to say, well, everything? Do you always respond that way? And why is that?
Well, it's experience. It's 30 years of experience of knowing and being personally involved with many of these stories, knowing the fact that what mainstream has reported on the large scale of macro is absolutely not true. What we were told about, just for example, what we were told about Osama bin Laden was a lie. What we were told about TWA Flight 800 was a lie. What we were told about Waco was a lie. What we were told about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a lie. What we were told about, almost everything was a lie on the big issues. And unfortunately, we live in a place now where the consumers of news have been so dumbed down, they don't bother to question anymore, and they just kind of absorb that, or I think in many cases now they ignore it.
I think that, and I think that also, it's so repetitive that they begin to absorb it. Maybe initially they may have some doubts about what they're reading, but it keeps being written and over again until they actually make it a fact. And we were talking about this the last time, that something we've seen from the Bush administration, the rewriting of history. If they say it enough times, hopefully people will begin to forget what the actual truth is.
Yes.
And so let me talk to you a little bit about Osama bin Laden, because I thought this was an interesting thing that you said that we were lied to about it. And you actually wrote a piece after about the fact that after Osama bin Laden was captured and then killed, after he was killed, they produced DNA results showing that this was Osama bin Laden, to prove that they had indeed killed the Osama bin Laden. And you actually had a molecular biologist write and in a piece that you were writing about the death of him, questioning whether or not the Obama administration had killed him. And in his piece, he said that the one thing I know about DNA, and you repeated this, is that you cannot take a tissue sample from a shot in the noggin dead guy in a north central Pakistan Special Forces op, extract the DNA, prepare the DNA for assay, test the DNA, curate the raw DNA sequence data, assemble the reads or QC the genotype, compare the tested DNA to a reference, and make a positive identity determination. And this is coming from a very well-respected microbiologist who did not go on the record, though. Yeah. All in 12 hours, and he's saying you can't do all of that all in 12 hours, let alone transport the tissue samples all the places they need to have gone in order to get this done. So do you base your distrust, do you say that President Obama was lying about killing Osama bin Laden because of the DNA issue, or is there something else behind it?
Well, there's a much longer and deeper history to that. In my book, Crossing the Rubicon, The Decline of the American Empire at the End of the Age, which is like 600 pages, 1,000 footnotes. It's in the Harvard Biz Library. It's a reference book now. It's a very popular.
And it's used in teaching. Very
much in many universities, and it's like way high on the Amazon poli-sci reference list. So it's never been challenged. But and what I track in that, and here I give great credit to another researcher who was working from the time of 9/11 on, Paul Thompson, who had an incredible the terror timeline. You can Google that; you'll find it instantly. It's all tied to mainstream news sources around the world, whether it's Times of India, Times of Pakistan, Al Jazz. But major publications that you and I know follow standard rules of journalism. And extremely clear evidence from 9/11 on. I mean, major stories, incredible publications. I have respect for Al Jazz, but they weren't the only one. There were many others.
Are you talking about Al Jazeera?
Yes. And sorry, that's the...
No, it's fine. I just want to be clear.
That Osama bin Laden was dead in 2002, 2003, latest 2004 as a result of kidney failure and dialysis. And it was generally assumed, and I have been still plugged into the intelligence community, SEAL team members and members of CIA and so forth.
So this is difficult to believe in the sense that, one, a lot of the people in the Arab world doubted that this was the killing of Osama bin Laden. I mean, that was the headline, that they were lying. So if Al Jazeera and other intelligence sources in the Arab world, why would they have doubted what we were saying and not have said what you're saying? Not have said he was already killed? And number two, why didn't the Bush administration use this as a way to show how effective their war on terror had become?
Well, if bin Laden had died on his own outside of custody, that would essentially mean that he won. He avoided capture for his whole life. But I personally believe, and there is an enormous amount of evidence showing that Osama bin Laden was a CIA creation. The bin Laden family runs a major construction company in Saudi Arabia, very closely tied to the royal family. Major government contracts. There were CIA connections.
And connections to the Bush family as well.
Major connections to the Bush family, which are probably too long to go into now, but they're all footnoted in Rubicon. And I believe him to have been a total creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, to be someone that we could put up as a straw man to fight and to blame on, because well, leaving aside the fact that it's technically impossible for 19 hijackers working from a cave to have accomplished what happened on September 11th. I don't think we can put that aside. I think we're going to have to stop there and ask you, because, I mean, I think that somebody who's listening is going to say, maybe that's almost an apologist kind of attitude, that we're too great for 19 guys to have gotten in here, and maybe it was a tremendous failure of the American intelligence community. You know what the reason that's been given by the government for how these hijackers were able to accomplish what they accomplished. You believe, actually, that
you said this in your book, Crossing the Rubicon, published in 2004, and you claimed that Dick Cheney and the U.S. government were in collusion with the perpetrators of 9/11. And I want to know, on what evidence are you basing those claims?
Collusion, I think, is a bit.
Should say, yeah, let it happen. I guess, I mean,
misleading. No,
what's the word you would use?
The attacks were orchestrated by Dick Cheney. They were maestroed by Dick Cheney, and that goes to the chapter on war games that I wrote in the book, where I have absolute on-the-record information from U.S. Air Force sources showing that 24 false radar blips were injected onto radar screens during the hijackings themselves in war game exercises directly under the control of Vice President. Vice President.
Please explain. Okay, first of all, let me ask you, why do you object to the use of the word collusion?
Because collusion would to me imply you have this group who can do one thing and this group, and they decide to cooperate together. No, the whole thing was run at the U.S. government level. The undisputed records that...
so these hijackers are essentially assets, then?
Well, we have undisputed records, and here I cited stories from ABC, NBC, Newsweek, and so forth. You don't want to challenge them, showing that Mohammed Atta and Al-Hazmi, several of the hijackers, had attended military flight training schools. Atta, I think, at Maxwell Air Force Base in Florida. But in point of fact, none of the hijackers, aside from the ones that it was known to have attended military schools, had obtained a pilot's license, let alone the ability to fly a multi-engine jet aircraft, which requires an instrument rating and perform maneuvers that fighter pilots wouldn't want to perform. So I believe, and I think the evidence is very clear, and I got to say that Rubicon is the second or third largest selling book about September 11th after the Kane Commission report. And it's, it's in the library, still in Barnes and Nobles. No, the U.S. government has never even acknowledged that the book exists.
I think they would be wise, given what you're saying.
Yes, because I used their records. I also used military
Okay, well,
records.
let's talk about, you said Dick Cheney was in charge of these war games that were happening. And explain again, like, how he allowed, well, I guess the real question I should ask here is, if Dick Cheney was responsible, what's the end game? What was the end game for him?
Oil. Iraqi oil.
And this is an excuse to go into Iraq, as it turned, even though there's no connection?
And that was another one of the big lies the government told, that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, when we all know that he didn't. And as a matter of fact, there's a long list of on-the-record statements of government officials saying that Richard Clark, I think, for example, was one, saying that, okay, we're all looking at Afghanistan, and then the word came from Rumsfeld and all the people in the Pentagon were going to Iraq. And everyone, what? Why are we going to Iraq? Now, Saddam Hussein was a threat for two reasons. Iraq had, at the time, the second largest oil reserves on the planet, which had been lying fallow, essentially, since the sanctions from the '91 Gulf War. So they hadn't been tapped as much. The infrastructure was tapped. But Saddam Hussein was also moving to price in euros. And the threat to dollar hegemony made him public enemy number 1A. 1+, whatever. And so that became a major priority for the U.S. government. And that, I wouldn't say mission accomplished when you've killed 2 million Iraqi civilians.
But they did get control of the oil.
They did get control of the oil.
Which was the real mission.
Which was controlled now under production sharing agreements, so that various countries that needed that oil, and that would include Russia and China, got their share, but all priced in U.S. dollars.
Now, what evidence do you have that Cheney was involved? You said about the war games. I mean, people are sitting probably at their tables going, is he crazy? So you can't just allude to, I had tons of evidence, or you can look at reports. Tell me what it is exactly that you believe, the evidence that you included that ties Cheney to 9/11.
Okay, well, first of all, again, everything is footnoted in the book, so everything I assert has a footnote to back it up. But I use U.S. government records from May of 2001, at which time there was a major change in NORAD intercept protocol, North American Air Defense Command, that's U.S. Air Force, the people that would have responded to the hijacks. My father flew in interceptors. He was an Air Force veteran. So I grew up with this. I knew this. That system had been in place for 50 years and operated flawlessly. It's not the first time somebody had considered it flying airplanes into buildings. That was thought about in the 50s and the 40s. Gee, maybe somebody could make a bomb and put it in a Cessna, and
so fly into.
But the scramble procedures prior to that point were all automatic. You got a hijack. Pilots have a button on the yoke that they push to confirm for a hijack. And so you have the confirmed hijacks. NORAD had the complete ability to scramble and intercept. That's not shoot down, just intercept to fly beside the aircraft. But what happened in May is that the entire chain of command for scrambling in the event of a hijack was placed under the control of the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President, which bypassed all of the standard, because the pilots know what to do. That's what they've practiced for their whole life. That was changed. Also in May of 2001, all war game exercises were placed under the direct control of the Vice President Dick Cheney. That was a White House document that I got off the White House website. Now that's in May.
And was he ever questioned about that change?
No.
Okay.
No. So,
but that was a strange change in protocol. I mean, really a major deal.
Absolutely bizarre.
Okay.
Didn't make any sense. Why would the military need to confer with the Vice President to run either a field training exercise, which is where you actually do it in the field, or a command post exercise, which is a computer tabletop? But then, at a time when everybody in the country was aware of possibly hijacked planes being crashed into buildings, we know that those memoranda were floating all over the U.S. government.
Yes, and there's a particular one that became public, the one in August,
yes,
that everybody was alluding to, that Bush saw and disregarded, or did not react to.
There were many more than that, and I have them all in Crossing the Rubicon, all footnoted and sourced.
And where'd you get those? I mean, not the source, but like where the memos coming from the intelligence community?
Some papers and some periodicals did some excellent journalism, and they published small stories, but they never got
to link it together. There was no big picture?
No big picture,
right.
And they never crossed the threshold into public consciousness, but I found them. Then I also developed my own sources. I started calling NORAD. I mean, I was a detective. I'm a journalist. That's what you do. You know, you turn the tape recorder, start calling, taking it.
That's what people used to do.
Yes.
Right.
So, but over the course now of the summer of 2001, at the time when all these tensions are increasing and all of the alerts are increasing, Dick Cheney scheduled 5 separate war games: Vigilant Guardian, Vigilant Warrior, Northern Vigilance. There was a slew of them, in which he took the fighter aircraft out of the Northeast Air Defense Sector, which was the command locus for the response on 9/11. And he sent them to Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, and Iceland to participate for weeks in a drill preparing for Russian bombers to come over. This is out of the 1950s. It's Dr. Strangelove. Now, why at a time when everybody's alert for hijacked aircraft being crashed into buildings would you transfer all your fighters out of the region? But the most telling work came out of Canadian papers. I believe it was the Toronto Star. Again, the footnotes are in the book, but this was all confirmed. I got documents. On the day of 9/11, it was Vigilant Guardian, I believe, was the exercise where 22 false radar blips were injected onto the radar screens of the Northeast Air Defense Sector. And that means the air traffic controllers now say you have 5 hijackings, but in the middle of this war game exercise, you're looking at a screen now and you've got 30.
Are the air controllers notified when these kinds of things are going on beforehand?
There are on the record transcripts of radio traffic between military and FAA personnel and emails and so forth, saying there's a war game exercise in process, we don't know what to do, and this was again confirmed by the Toronto Star and one other paper in Canada. And USA Today also broke a good story on this.
So were they grounded when the grounding order came out and all the planes were grounded in the States?
I don't know that they were all grounded. That I've never fully, a couple down in Norfolk, maybe down near DC may have been grounded. But the problem is, if you have all the fighters out of the region, you may only have 8 fighters left in the region. Now, if you know anything about interceptors, they fly in pairs. You have a wingman flying with. So if you have 8 fighters, you can only pick 4 targets to respond to. And if you have 26, 27 possible hijackings, you're paralyzed because fighters will respond on afterburner, and you'll burn up all your fuel to get to what may be a hijacking, and you go and you find out it's a false blip.
So here's the thing then, as these planes are heading towards the Pentagon, and was there no planes for them to send up because everybody was otherwise occupied?
Well, no. Let's say you probably want to take New York, Pennsylvania, and D.C. separately because they all manifested differently. But with the case of New York, clearly the fighters didn't know where to go. And and so they just held still until they knew where. But this was a very telling event, which provided probably one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the book. There was a press spokesman for the 1st Air Force, Major Don Arias at Tyndall Air Force Base, and because I come from, I could talk to him. And I picked up an Air Force publication that said during the hijack, he had left his post at the command post where the fighters are being scrambled. Now that's ostensibly where you got the best information outside of the Pentagon. And left and went to a payphone or went to his cell phone to call his brother, who was a New York firefighter in the South Tower, and said, "Get the fuck out of there." Because he couldn't do it, because he knew, everybody at 1st Air Force and the Pentagon knew that I think it was 77, was flying toward the South Tower, and there was a 45-minute window between the first and the second plane. Everybody knew that second plane.
Knew, but they didn't go up?
The orders were not issued to abandon the building. The orders were not issued. There's a second hijack on the way, and the fighters were not sent there.
That's what I'm asking, the fighters.
Yes. They were not sent there.
Do you think Cheney had something to do with not sending the fighters there?
Cheney had, the NORAD scramble procedures had been changed, and he was running the war games. Yes, I absolutely do.
So is this something along the lines of, I mean, then what you're claiming is that it's sort of along the lines of, say, World War II, we let ourselves be attacked so that we'll have a reason, let Pearl Harbor be attacked so that we'll have a reason to invade somewhere else. We let 3,000 people die so we had a reason to go into Iraq?
Absolutely. This is the curse of my family. My mother was a senior cryptanalyst at the Army Security Agency, the place where the Japanese codes were broken, and before she died. And she died in 2001, but before she died, she admitted that we had broken the Japanese codes a long time before Pearl Harbor. There's a good reason why 5 carriers, the Essex, the Yorktown, the Lexington, the Hornet, and all of those were not in Pearl Harbor. Those carriers were spared. And we provoked the Japanese into attacking with an oil embargo earlier in the year, and we started strangling their oil supplies. So it provided, it's pure, but this is as old as Caesar.
That's why I brought it up, because it sounds very much like that. And I know that a lot of the American people at the time in World War II were isolationists. So you really did. And I think there was an easier job here to provoke the public into sanctioning a war in Iraq, because they seem to go like lemmings as one member of the administration after another came forward to talk about the alleged weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it was quite a blanketing of the networks. You had Condoleezza Rice out in front, you had Colin Powell saying things, and you had Rumsfeld and Cheney and everybody on the same page. So in addition to having 9/11 and the fear and the desire to kill somebody because of what happened to us, you also had a very orchestrated effort on top of that to convince the American people to invade Iraq.
Well, indeed, and there were several lapses on many parts from many estates, if you will, or from many positions. One thing I should add is Major Don Arias gave me on-the-record written confirmation. Richard Clark, who was the national...
on-the-record written confirmation of what?
That Richard Clark named another war game exercise in his book, Against All Enemies, or whatever, whatever it was. And I caught that. I go, wait a minute, that's a new war game exercise. So I asked Major Don Arias what it was, and I know from my clearances in the family that names like Vigilant Guardian, Vigilant Warrior designate certain things, and he said, you're absolutely right. And what he told me, and he put it in an email to me, that in addition to all these other hijack drills, there was an airliner posing in a field training exercise, flying as a hijacked airliner while the hijackings were taking place. Now, somebody with a 50 IQ ought to be able to sit down and go, why at a time when they were worried about hijacked planes being crashed in the building, would you do something that stupid? Would you transfer all the fighters out and inject all these radar blips and confuse everybody? And all that was conveniently happening as the attacks occurred.
Now, how did Cheney go about consolidating the amount of power that he had? And I think it's something that a lot of the American people wonder about. There were jokes about it. And there seems to be some validity to the jokes. Some truth, or some veracity, I guess, to what people were joking about. How did he manage to consolidate and play such a central role and take so much power from Bush? Was that the plan all along, or what are your thoughts about that?
Dick Cheney has been a master political operative since the days of Gerald Ford. When he was a congressman from Wyoming. But he is...
Does he have some sort of clearance? I mean, was he involved in...
He was a mocker. I mean, he was the chairman also of Halliburton. And if one looks at what's happened with the U.S. government taking on the banks after 2008, one could argue that the banks run the country as opposed to Washington. Well, one could say the same thing about the oil companies and the oil service companies. Halliburton is a major overseas player, long documented to be a CIA crony that provides fronts, especially through subsidiaries like Kellogg, Brown and Root, which I've written about many, many times.
Subsidiaries, what is it doing? I mean, yeah. Could you explain that a little bit more? You're saying that Halliburton is involved with the CIA in what respect?
Well, Halliburton, a lot of major companies. It's not just Halliburton.
But let's focus on Halliburton because they played a big role, and I think people are familiar with it from Fahrenheit 9/11. I mean,
yeah.
And also because Cheney was running it, so
right.
And gave favorable contracts to Halliburton when we did invade Iraq.
And Halliburton looted the U.S. government, engaged in all kinds of massive fraud. But that goes back to Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina, when KBR contractors, Kellogg, Brown and Root, were all over the region, and there was money being siphoned and stolen, embezzled, and so on and so forth.
But they really didn't come to the public consciousness until the Iraq War, I think, the general public, because
right.
There was an attempt to point out to the American people what was going on with Halliburton and Dick Cheney's relationship to Halliburton, and it never stuck.
Never stuck. And that's part of the, I guess, if you will, the science now, because I firmly believe that the mainstream media, being corporate entities serving infinite growth, concerned about their share prices and their price to earnings ratios and their dividends, there is no fourth estate anymore. It's all one estate, and that's just a different department now, as far as the mainstream media goes.
So what role, what was the connection, what was Halliburton doing with the CIA? I mean, how did they assist the CIA? How is that mutually beneficial to both parties?
All over the world, but being a major oil services company, they're heavy construction, heavy contractors. So when you had subsidiaries like Brown and Root, they were building Cam Ranh Bay, let's say in Vietnam. When you needed to go into Kandahar to build a base in Kandahar, you need
So they provide a service, but you give them the optimum money-making opportunities.
Yes.
Okay. And now let me. But if you could answer the second part of my question, where was President Bush in all of this?
He was there in the White House. I
know he was there because I saw pictures of him. But what was he doing while Dick Cheney was siphoning away all his power?
I don't know. I don't think Dick Cheney was. I don't think it was as if W didn't know. I think W was a party to that through the whole.
But your focus is on Cheney when you write about things.
Yes.
I mean, and not on the president. Is there a reason for that?
Personally, because I don't think George W. Bush is smart enough to do
much.
Do
you think he was Cheney's puppet? I mean, do you think he was just put in there as a puppet, and that the rest of that Rumsfeld, Cheney, and I know people have made this allegation, but is there some evidence that you unearthed to show that while I do believe he was aware, but let's say he's aware, but some evidence to show that most of the major decisions during his administration internationally in terms of war were made by Cheney and his cohorts?
George W. Bush is, however, a Bush. Now, the Bush family is a completely different kettle of fish than George W. Bush standing alone by himself. Okay, the Bush family, and probably one of the biggest investigative pieces that I wrote after 9/11 was absolutely proving of massive insider trading on the financial markets. And I'm talking Tokyo, Toronto, New York, London, Berlin. So there was obviously huge foreknowledge with massive put options being placed on American and United Airlines. So W.
Okay, and let's clarify for the audience then. What we're talking about is that there is manipulation of the markets going on and betting on something like 9/11 to happen so that they will be in a position to make money after something like that. And there was some reporting about that.
Yes.
But again, something that doesn't really stick because it's too horrible to imagine that people were waiting for something like that to happen. Now, do you think when they're making those kinds of moves in the market that they were hoping that something would happen, or that they were involved in orchestrating it?
It's clear that there's, as a matter of fact, the Asia Times within the last 6 months just resurrected the whole issue again and used my work, which is in Crossing the Rubicon, all of the documentation on the trades. Now, what you had was grossly anomalous placement of put options. That's a bet that the stock price is absolutely going to fall. So that
on certain airlines.
Right.
But not on
only on United and American.
Right.
And totally disproportionate to all other trades and all other puts on all other airlines, all placed in the same period. And options have a window of 30 days or 60, 90-day window, but all those windows perfectly covered September the 11th.
Right.
Tens of billions of dollars were made on those put options, because what a put option says is it's a guaranteed ability to sell a share at a certain price. So if the puts fall and the share price drops by $50 a share, you buy at the bargain price, but you've got a guaranteed sale at 200%.
I know, but what is the connection to say that that's not just wishful thinking? I mean, what's the connection to say that they thought that they helped to orchestrate something tangible to make those trades, to have beneficial results?
Well,
to make those trades work.
Nothing like that has ever happened before. When you single out specific airlines, United and American,
you're expecting an attack on them. Do you think that the CIA, that somebody was sharing the intelligence about what the airlines were going to be?
Oh, the intelligence was known around the world. It's something else I documented in Crossing the Rubicon, which is that the White House, the U.S. government, had received detailed warnings from the Russian DFS, Foreign Intelligence Service, from MI6, even from the Israelis. Very specific warnings, and if you put them together, what was very clear that was hijacked airliners from American and United are going to be crashed into the World Trade Center in the week of September the 9th. As a matter of fact, Vladimir Putin was on television 2 days after the attacks, and I confirmed, I pulled the story on this, and he said, I sent a specific delegation to warn President Bush that planes were going to be hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. These were direct warnings. So, and the knowledge turns out to have been in Morocco and many, many other countries that these attacks were coming again during this week. Now, if we backpedal a little bit, why was Dick Cheney sending all the fighters out of the region?
When there's this much intelligence.
Why was he, when you have all these countries warning you of this, why do you paralyze your own defense system at that time?
Okay, well, let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about your police background, because we are in Los Angeles, and you're uniquely qualified to look back on what the changes have been in the LAPD. Mm-hmm. I think just so you worked with the LAPD and have remained close with the department during the Rodney King and Rampart division scandals, mm-hmm. okay? And mm-hmm. Rodney King, we all know about. Rampart was a great deal of corruption in that Rampart division of the Los Angeles Police Department. And I'm wondering, you left the police department. Let me just let my viewers understand, why is it that you stopped, why you left the Los Angeles Police Department?
Well, I came from a CIA family. The CIA had tried officially to recruit me, and I was approached in the mid-1970s, with the offer of big rewards, promotions, and so on.
But does the CIA take a lot of its people from police departments like that? Is that a common thing?
They don't take people from, they like to leave them in police departments. That's why they hire them, because they're in the police department.
So you stay there, but you're still working for the CIA.
And that's the cover.
Okay.
And it was well documented through the Church Pike hearings of the 1970s and later that CIA would place case officers and put them through the police academy. As a matter of fact, that was the first pitch that was made to me, that I would become a case officer and then go through the academy.
Now, did your mother recommend you?
Mother or father, no. It
just happened.
Well, when I started interning for LAPD, when I was starting UCLA, they ran a background check on me, and they found out that I had a Q clearance, which is cleared to handle atomic secrets above top secret. I had a higher clearance than the Chief of Police, Ed Davis, but that was solely because I lived with both of my parents. My father was liaison between CIA, Martin Marietta, and the U.S. Air Force for spy satellites. So it was assumed that I would roll into that, and I was an honors grad from UCLA, and the CIA wanted me, obviously, for many reasons, and I turned them down. I was pitched first when I was a senior at UCLA, second time when I was on the job, and that was a sexual pitch from the standard recruitment from a very beautiful CIA career contractor. I didn't know at the time, but that was how the offer was made, and the pitch was. And this tied perfectly with stories as we move ahead to Gary Webb and Iran-Contra. The pitch was that I would be placed in a position called NIN, where Narcotics Intelligence Network. It's not a fixed desk, but whenever any police officer or detective wants to serve a search warrant on a drug dealer, they have to call NIN. I think it's now called Clearinghouse, so that they aren't serving a search warrant where the FBI's got an undercover informant inside in the state, so you don't screw up major stuff. And if the NIN guy says don't serve, you don't serve. Now that's what happened in the Ricky Ross case many years later when my dear friend Gary Webb broke his stories. And we see that search warrants were issued for 19 locations for Freeway Ricky Ross, and when the cops got there, every house had been suddenly cleaned out, and the warrants had only been issued like 5 hours before.
And you made very public allegations that the CIA was working with their operatives, I guess, or their assets in the LAPD, to sell drugs in South Central.
See, again, because I'm a writer,
Go ahead.
I like to be precise.
Well, go ahead.
The CIA wasn't actively doing retail
That's
sales
right.
on the street corner. The CIA was seeing to it that C-130 Hercules with 2,000 and 3,000 kilos at a time were landing on military bases, and by whatever vehicles they were.
They were allowing drugs into the country.
Because those drugs then would generate cash, which was subsequently laundered on Wall Street. That's why my book's in the Harvard Biz Library, because that's what I documented. So CIA didn't participate in that, but they wanted to make sure that their drug shipment and their drug channels, whether they be in Mena, Arkansas, whether they be in Southern California, El Toro Marine Air was a situation, Arizona, got delivered and got sold.
And then they would take the cash.
CIA
You've
would
documented this, yeah.
take the cash, but Bill Casey was a stockbroker. Ronald Reagan's DCI, CIA director, was a stockbroker. But again, it would be the criminal organizations working in partnership with CIA. But that money would all get laundered through major banks. And this is extremely well documented. Nobody can challenge this. I mean, you know, Citigroup.
I think it's a civics lesson that you're giving. So
yeah, I mean, all the major banks were doing it.
A twisted civics lesson, but I think people, I think that I just have to stop you for a second, because I know people that are watching are going to go, oh, I just don't believe this. And I think what they really need to do is to read your book. And I think that they will understand that you're not, I guess what a lot of people would say, talking out of your ass here, that you've actually done the research. Let me move you from that. You opted not to become involved with the CIA, but I'm wondering, you ultimately ended up leaving the police department, and I'm curious, since you still have some ties there and you have some knowledge of it, do you think from your time, and it's rare to have somebody on who worked during that period and is familiar with both of the Rodney King riots and also the Rampart Division scandal, do you think that department has changed considerably since then, and that it is less racist, or do you think some of the problems that have been identified over the years are still quite rampant in the police department?
I think that Rodney King brought about enormous good changes, positive changes within LAPD. But what I absolutely see, and I saw this confirmed in the Chris Dorner case, is that there is...
In the which case?
Christopher Dorner case.
Okay.
That there is an old guard mentality that has remained in place, upper middle manager levels. The captains who run the trial boards, the guys in the city attorney's office, that good old boy network has by and large, obviously, not been checked, and it hasn't been changed that much. And I think these guys have become very arrogant.
So basically, and I think this is something that people could understand, I think it happens also in corporations, where you have the same top level of people, but if we get down to the streets, you're going to have a different situation with who gets arrested and who doesn't get arrested, because you have more racially and ethnically diverse force. Is that true, do you think? By
and large, yes. But when it's the captains, the commanders at LAPD, that's a core DNA that has kind of remained in place. I mean, Chief Beck now, his father was a deputy chief when I was a policeman. And one of the captains, Phil Tinker.
Is that bad, do you think? Do you think that in order to have real change in the police department, you need to have somebody break through and change that top layer of people, break into the good old boys network and change the leadership there to have concrete change in that department?
I don't think it's a matter of off with everybody's heads, if you will, just to get rid of the old guard, because you meet the new boss same as the old boss. But I used to talk about this at great length with a dear friend, Jesse Brewer, who was a black police commissioner during the King riots, and he was an assistant chief. He had been my captain years back when I first got involved with CIA, and he was a good man. He's a mentor. It's the attitude that has to change. Just because somebody's name is Beck and there was a deputy chief named Beck, that's not conviction for anything. However, when you see, when I saw the way in Christopher Dorner's manifesto, which I believe was doctored, but the first part I totally accepted, you could see that this is exactly this way it used to work. When they wanted to get rid of somebody, they'd control his trial board rep, and his trial board rep would pull this, and the guy who ran the trial board would do this, and they had a city attorney, and it was all rigged once the decision was made that the guy had to go. And I think that's a fundamental mistake they made with Christopher Dorner. He was too educated. He was too savvy. You can't get away with this. And those who win in a rigged game get stupid. And I'm sure that LAPD has maybe every major police department has undertaken some serious looks inside itself as a result of him. He was a.
Okay. Well, let me switch back to the government, and I want to ask you if you think that. If the country is controlled by Wall Street, basically, and I don't think there are too many people anymore who would argue with you, and we can't trust that even the fundamental, check plus on the killing of Osama bin Laden by the Obama administration, that even happened. Do you think that this particular administration under President Obama is any more honest than those that have come before? Or do you think we have another? Is it the same as George W. Or do you think that it's even worse? I mean, how do you rate what's going on right now?
I would view it systemically, and let's take a comparison with, for example, alcoholism or drug addiction. It's a disease. Over any considerable period of time, it gets worse, never better, because you always crave and do more. So rather than lay it on Barack Obama, who I have no respect for, especially after NDAA and so many of the lies that he's told about, what he was going to do.
I'm sorry, what are you referring to?
The National Defense Authorization Act that's now on its way to the Supreme Court that allows the President of the United States to kill or imprison without charge American citizens, which is patently unconstitutional. But that's a progressive.
And that is the beginning of where you look at him and say, I have no respect for that.
Well, it wasn't the beginning, but it is certainly the cherry on top of the cake.
All right.
And so I think it's just a progressive disease. Criminality, once it becomes criminality, decline, corruption becomes, and I wouldn't look at the soup as being an Obama soup. I'd look at it as being, a great sickness, moral sickness soup.
Do you think
out of control.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on it. That's out of control was your last line.
That's okay.
Or your last statement. The thing that really, I'm just curious, do you think that Obama, to me, it seems that shift in presidential power that it's gotten since 9/11, that the president has consolidated an inequitable amount of power, and the balance of power between the legislature and between the executive branch is completely out of whack. And I saw his exercising of the ability to kill American citizens as just sort of taking what George W. started during 9/11, taking those executive powers and building on it. And it's odd because one would expect just the opposite in a Democratic presidency, because we all complained about that. So I think I'm just curious, do you think that the balance of power has been irrevocably switched between the executive and the legislative branch? I mean, pretty much we're back to World War II here, that they've used a war to consolidate executive power, and without the fourth estate, that we have a total something, despite everybody, all the Republicans yelling about, respecting the founders, that we don't have anything close to what we started with.
No, absolutely not. But I would look at it more that Wall Street and the banking industry, bear in mind, Barack Obama issued $14-15 trillion in bailouts, which bailed out the banks and put the bank's debt on your back and my back. Okay, he transferred that debt from the banks, and that's no different from the Bush administration. So,
well, the Bush supported that, the Bush administration. But here's the thing: so he puts that on our back and your back. And then Wall Street had the temerity to turn around and say they weren't going to be supporting him. Was that just for show during the last election?
Absolutely,
because you know how they were all interviewed and said that Obama has not been kind to Wall Street. And in fact, it was quite the opposite.
Exactly.
Because there've been like minuscule prosecutions of like the jetsam and the flotsam involved.
Yes.
In, this is what you say when you're prosecuting somebody, the low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
In the financial, in the collapse of the banks. Do you think there's any some validity or to the argument that Obama made that if he hadn't bailed out the banks, the whole system would have collapsed and we would have suffered even more than we're suffering now?
Well, I think it should.
The lower level.
I think it should have collapsed, and I think it will collapse, and I think it's absolutely necessary. And to go back to your question about power versus the executive versus the legislative branch, I would look at it, my viewpoint is that both branches have been successfully purchased, co-opted, and owned by Wall Street and the big banks. Look at what the business that lobbyists do and the way campaign finances run.
Well, I think it's just strange that the legislature, I think in past administrations, would have raised up their hands and said, we should have a say in who we're killing. I mean, usually, and there have been times even, where war is declared during Vietnam. I mean, so I get that the president is always trying to consolidate power, but generally there's a bit of a pushback from the legislature. So I'm just curious. I think if the whole government is being run by Wall Street, that they put most of their chips into the president at this point.
Well, it's much more efficient that way.
Yeah. I mean, is that your view? I'm
fewer points
throwing
of
it on the
contact.
table here. I'm not exactly arguing with the purchase of both branches of government,
right,
but I actually think that we're seeing an unprecedented consolidation of power in this particular president.
And if you look at it from, let's take from another dimension, if you will, that the corruption is so obvious, it's so stinky, that there's only one place to go. Obviously, economically, tens of millions of people in this country are hurting. Collapse of human industrial civilization is underway. We're not going back to growth. We're not going back to 2006. So you have to move toward a totalitarian police state. Which is why Department of Homeland Security bought something like 40 million rounds of handgun ammunition last year. And while they're doing the big push on gun control, the U.S. government just made an emergency order for 7,000 assault rifles for Homeland Security. They're preparing for civil unrest. And in the history of the collapse of empires, as totalitarianism comes, it's like a stage of cancer that you go through. And it won't last in this country because there's not enough energy and resources to make it last. So.
Well, if somebody's listening to our conversation, they probably poked themselves in the eye with a hot poker and decided that all is lost. And you and I have discussed this when we were just chatting informally. Mm-hmm. Is there, and you've reached a place where you're not railing, you're just calmly stating the facts and what's to come. Is there something for the average citizen to do to try to break through the corruption? Is there somewhere for them to look, something for them to read, someone to contact? I mean, what does a person do when they listen to our conversation to try to start to make some changes in what's going on?
I'm not alone in my position. There's a great many other writers and authors, but I've been predicting a lot of this for 2 decades now, so I'm kind of tired. It's all here. I've got a 3 million word record. I don't think the system is reparable, and I think it is a mistake to direct one's energy or to direct one's thinking into saying, well, we can write a petition or we can find a candidate. You don't get to run for president unless you're controlled anymore. There is no way to reform this system. It is too utterly corrupt, and it's obviously corrupt to almost everybody in the whole world. And on the contrary, I think there's a lot of people going to be watching the show going,
well, I certainly think that you've made a lot of really valid points, and I think that for anybody who's disagreeing with you or finding what you're saying to be illogical or untrue, that they should read your book. And that would give them, it gives a much bigger picture. We can't even hope to cover what you've written because, like you said, it's 600 pages, but it is well-resourced and documented, and it's sort of you did your homework.
It's been on the shelves for 9 years, and nobody's ever challenged it, and it's used in universities all over the world now. So.
But anyway, I want to thank you so much for talking with us. I want to tell everybody that if they have comments or they want to talk to you, they can write things on the Facebook page, and we'll pass things along to you so that you can respond.
Yep.
I want to also encourage everybody to write in, look at the website, but give us your comments and let us know what you're thinking about today's discussion, because I think it was a really important one. And I appreciate you sharing your expertise in some areas that are kind of esoteric and that a lot of us don't understand. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, I know that everybody is a little bit smarter after this conversation.
Let's hope so. And
I hope so.
It's always a treat being with you, too.
Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you again on next week's Media Mayhem.